A new patient? I asked my secretary, slightly outraged. Please, sir, she tried to plead with me. You have to. I am completely overbooked as it is. I simply cannot take anyone else. But she's my cousin, she said as she stood up from the front desk. That doesn't mean anything, I tried to explain. I cannot make exceptions with things like this. Dr. Martin, the secretary raised the voice a little louder than usual. I looked at her with one curious cocked eyebrow. The secretary realized the mistake and lowered her voice back down. She needs it. She needs you. I was prepared to reject the proposition again, but I saw that hopeless, desperate look in her eyes. She couldn't bear to take any answer other than yes. Fine, I finally submitted to my strange gut feeling. She was nearly jumping for joy upon hearing the news. Thank you so much, Doctor. She quickly sat back down in a rolling office chair and began frantically typing on her computer. I'll tell her right now. All right. I began to make my way back to my office. Just let me know when you schedule a first appointment. My secretary meekly looked up from her computer. Oh, she already has one set for today. I stopped and quickly ran back over to her desk. Excuse me? She has an appointment set for 3 o'clock this afternoon. She tried to not be frightened by my slowly growing impatience. You mean to tell me that you scheduled an appointment for someone who wasn't even a patient yet? I tried to keep calm, but my anger was practically bursting out of my ears. My secretary didn't flinch. She stared directly at me and then turned back to her computer and repeated, She needs you. I sighed heavily and walked back to my office, defeated. I hate when she does stuff like that. At 3 in the afternoon that day, after finishing up with another patient, my secretary peeked into my office and told me that Phoebe, using a different name for privacy reasons and out of respect, was ready to come in. Who? I asked. The woman I told you about this morning, my cousin. I tried to roll my eyes in the most inconspicuous way possible. Then I said to let her in. I sat back in my chair, lazily waiting. The door to my office opened up, and in walked a middle-aged woman with beautiful long black hair. She looked about late 30s and seemed very reserved and shy. You must be Phoebe, I spoke as I began to examine the woman's demeanor. I tried to seem at least a little interested. After all, she was my patient. Yes, and thank you for taking me on such short notice. I know how busy you are. Phoebe approached my desk and confidently outstretched her hand. I leaned forward and shook her hand in return. It's no trouble, I assured. I motioned for her to sit in one of the many chairs around the room. Once she was comfortably seated, I began the session. So, first of all, what brings you here today? Phoebe shuffled a bit in her seat. She was clearly uncomfortable about answering. Ma'am? I gently prodded. Phoebe took in a deep breath. My daughter has this sort of friend, I guess you could call it. Go on. I began to feel genuinely intrigued. Well, she was beginning to sound a bit more comfortable, but she was still holding back. You see, this friend isn't actually there. I mean, she plays with him all the time, but I can only see her playing by herself. She'll play in the backyard for hours, and it always looks like she's talking to someone. All the little games she plays are meant to be played with 2 people. Then, when she comes inside, she'll talk about Mr. Whisper. She and him are becoming such good friends, but there's never anyone there. I'm getting a little scared. Ma'am? I did my best to sound professional when saying this. It sounds like your daughter made up an imaginary friend. It's very common for little children to create a friend of their own to play with. I know about imaginary friends, sir, she continued, but I think this is something else. Every time she talks about Mr. Whisper, I get this very uncomfortable feeling. I can't really describe it, but it's kind of like I'm in a submarine and the pressure is imploding in on me from all sides and I have a hard time breathing and... Phoebe began to grow noticeably dizzy and fell off of her chair. I ran over to her and helped her regain her balance. "Are you alright?" I asked. "Yeah, sorry. I guess I've just been a little stressed lately." Her voice sounded slightly breathy. I walked over to the water cooler and got Phoebe a cup of water. "Ma'am," I started, "I want to help you, but I don't know how any of this could be possible." I took the cup over to her to drink. "It doesn't seem right." "Listen." Phoebe knew she wasn't being fully heard, so she tried one last time. "My daughter is in some sort of danger. I don't know how to prove it yet, but I can feel it." "Phoebe, I'll tell you something," I tried to reason. "Go home and relax for a bit. Take a nice long nap if you have to." I began walking over to my office door, implying that it was time for her to leave. "If you feel these feelings again or anything new happens, give me a call, but I'm guessing that it's nothing more than a simple childhood imaginary friend." I opened the door and turned towards Phoebe again. She slowly got up out of her chair and walked over to the door. "An imaginary friend is only real in your mind. Mr. Whisper is actually real. I know it." Phoebe walked out of the office without even saying hello to her cousin on the way out. I felt bad about letting someone leave who was clearly in need of some sort of help, but there was nothing I could do. A few days later, I was on my lunch break and my secretary told me I had a call waiting on line 1. I dismissed her before answering it. I wasn't too surprised with the voice I heard. "Doctor?" asked the voice. It was Phoebe, only she sounded more anxious, more paranoid. I could tell just by listening to that one word that something had happened. "Is everything alright, ma'am?" I asked, truly concerned. I could sense Phoebe gathering all her thoughts before she spoke. I heard a slight breath in on the line. "I know you think I'm talking nonsense," she began, "but you have to at least try to believe me." She waited for a response, but I was waiting for her to speak, so she went on. "I can sense him all around me now. At first, I would just get that weird feeling whenever my daughter talked about him. But then I started getting it when I saw her playing with him. I could tell the difference between when she was playing alone and when she was playing with Mr. Whisper. She would act differently. I don't know how else to say it. Anyway, I started getting an odd feeling that my daughter was getting stressed out by something as well. She seemed off every now and then, but my daughter has always been the kind of child who doesn't want to show her weaknesses, so she never admitted anything to me. Then one day, my daughter told me she and Mr. Whisper had gotten into a little argument and that she wasn't going to play with him for a little while. I did what I needed to do and pretended to be upset, all that stuff. So she started playing with me a bit more. I didn't force her to at all. She just came to me and wanted to play together. I didn't complain at all. But then, one day, I noticed she had a few red scratches on her back and on her arm. Now, she had played outside on the playgrounds a few times recently, so I quickly assumed it had something to do with that, so I didn't ask her. However, a few days after that, I saw her playing outside again, except I had that really funny feeling again. I knew she was playing with Mr. Whisper again, but she didn't seem to be herself. she looked a little scared. When she came in for dinner that night, I could tell something was different about her. I told her I noticed she was playing with Mr. Whisper again, and she looked up at me with a pained expression. I had never seen her make that face before, but she quickly put on a fake smile and said, "Yeah, we got into a fight before, but now everything's alright." I told her I was proud of her for being a big girl, but I was so scared. From that day on, I noticed something happening. This sounds awful to say, but I started getting that horrible feeling whenever I was around my daughter. I would see her walk through the house and I would begin to feel faint, and every day it would get worse. I could see it on my daughter's face too. She was getting more scared every time I saw her. That's when I began to notice Mr. Whisper was starting to latch himself onto my daughter. I called you as soon as I figured it out. I sat with the phone against my ear and a dumbfounded look upon my face. I didn't know what approach to go for, so I just began talking and hoped something good would come out. "Ma'am, I've never experienced anything like this. It's very hard to tell exactly what we're dealing with here. If what you're saying is true, we could possibly be dealing with a supernatural entity here, and if that's the case, I'm in no position to help you." "No," Phoebe exclaimed, startling me for a moment. "There's no time to go to someone else. I'm afraid of what'll happen if we waste too much time." My mind raced as I attempted to come up with a solution. "How about this?" I prompted. "I will come see you after work and we can discuss in person what the best solution would be." The other line went silent for a moment. "All right," Phoebe answered. Her voice showed that she wasn't completely satisfied, but it would work for now. "If you send me your address, I will meet you there as soon as I get off of work," I added. Phoebe told me the address, and we talked a bit about the details before I said I had to go back to work. For the rest of the day, I conducted my other therapy sessions as usual, but my mind was unable to escape the thought of Phoebe and her poor daughter, and whatever ungodly thing was terrorizing them. The end of the day came, and I was packing up my things and getting ready to head over to Phoebe's house. I was just closing up my suitcase when my telephone rang. "Hello?" I answered. "Doctor," it was my secretary. She sounded very worried. "Phoebe is here to see you." I looked at my watch. Send her in, please." "Right away, sir." A few seconds later, a woman walked in, but it certainly wasn't the woman who had walked into my office a few days earlier. That woman was sharp and confident. This woman's long black hair had been completely messed and had several small grey streaks. Her face had been drained of colour, and it wore a solemn and fearful expression. Her lips looked cold and chapped, and out of them, the woman spoke. "I saw him." I gazed at her, but no words were spoken. I awkwardly motioned for her to sit, and then eagerly sat in my own desk seat. Phoebe slowly walked over to the chair, but she was clearly shaken. Her hands didn't stop moving the entire time she was in the office, and she kept glancing around the room as if expecting something to happen. She was majorly paranoid. "After I got off the phone with you," she began, "I decided to have a little talk with my daughter, so I brought her into the kitchen and sat her down at the seat that was directly facing mine. I asked what was going on in the past few days. She looked at me with a confused look, but her eyes knew exactly what I was talking about, and they couldn't lie. I told her that I knew something had been going on recently, and I was worried about her. She reassured me that she was fine and that there was nothing to worry about. I realized that if I wanted answers, I had to give her straightforward questions. So I leaned in real close to her and spoke softly as I asked her, "What is going on with you and—" Phoebe stopped and looked frantically around the room like a deer who hears a twig snap in the woods. She turned back to me and continued, "Her and you know who." I nodded in understanding. She went on, "Only I used his actual name. Apparently, when you whisper his name, he gets mad. Really mad. So, after I asked her, her face got very scared and she gave me a look that said, 'I am so sorry for what's about to happen. I would tell you to run, but there's no time.'" Phoebe began to breathe more heavily and was fidgeting more in her chair. Then this thing came at me, completely out of nowhere, and it just pounced on me. Phoebe paused for a long time. I can't even describe it. It was such an out-of-body experience. It's like I still have memory of it, but I just can't think of anything to describe it with. But doctor, it was horrifying. As soon as it was over, I was lying on the floor, wheezing in pain. My daughter came running over to me, and she tried to make me feel better, but she couldn't. Not after what I'd just been through. I thought hard about this. "And you can't describe it?" Phoebe shook her head sadly. "It would be like describing music to a deaf person." I thought again. I suddenly got an idea, but it would require a huge risk. I didn't know if I wanted to propose it or not, but while my mind was still deciding, my mouth made the decision for me. "How about this?" I started. "You go home and try to summon Mr. Whisper again. But this time," I reached into my suitcase and pulled out my digital camera. "Take a picture of it with this." I tossed the camera to Phoebe. "May I remind you that you absolutely do not have to go through this if you don't want to." "It's a good idea," she said, while still looking down at the camera. "But I'm still afraid of what's going to happen." I got up out of my chair and walked over to her. "That's perfectly understandable." I reached my arm out and put it on her shoulder. "But if you do this and then come into my office first thing tomorrow with a picture, then we'll have conclusive evidence that this thing exists." Phoebe thought for a moment longer. Then she slowly nodded. "I'll do it." The next day, I got to my office about an hour early so I could meet Phoebe when she got there. I sat down at my desk and anxiously waited for her to arrive. I began to think about what I would do if she was successful in taking the picture. I would be able to see exactly what was causing all the trouble with Phoebe and her daughter. But what would happen from there? I thought about bringing in a priest or a demonologist. It might work. It had to work. As the hour slowly passed, my excited anticipation soon turned to raw stress. It came time for my workday to start, but there was still no Phoebe. I walked out to my secretary and told her to notify me immediately if there was any word about Phoebe. I went back to my office and started working with my other patients. My mind wasn't in my office though. My mind was traveling all around, and the longer I heard no response, the faster my brain traveled. What have I done? I thought to myself. I've sent this poor woman straight to her doom. I should never have told her to take that picture. I should never have given her any advice about what to do. I should never have taken up this profession in the first place. I continued to beat myself up all morning. Then, almost as soon as one of my afternoon patients left my office, my telephone rang. I picked it up almost immediately upon hearing the first chime. "Hello?" I answered. As soon as I spoke, sweat began to form around my head. I was breathing so heavily that it could assuredly be heard on the other line. "Sir?" my secretary responded. She sounded almost as scared as I was. "Turn on the TV." This was not the response I was expecting, but I still knew exactly what I would see on that TV when I turned it on. I slowly bent down and grabbed the small black remote off my desk. "Which channel?" I hesitantly asked. "Any of them," she answered. I set the receiver down on my desk and nearly flinched as I aimed the remote at the small TV on one of my office's corner walls and pressed the power button. There was a reporter standing in front of a small suburban house. I don't remember everything she said, because I was mostly in shade at this point, but I could hear a general idea. While reports are still flooding in from neighbours about the horrifying sounds they heard from this house last night, there is still a large amount of evidence missing from this crime. Last night, at approximately 10:30, 37-year-old Phoebe Callaghan was attacked by something that is still unknown. The cause and the events of the brawl are also a mystery at this time, but what is known is that many neighbours nearby heard Callaghan's helpless cries, and many of them also heard a shrill, high-pitched screech that didn't seem to belong to any human or animal. When authorities arrived at the scene, they found Callaghan's body horribly warped and mutilated. Her once dark black hair had turned to a solid grey, and her eyes and face lacked colour. A small digital camera lay merely inches from her body. Callaghan is sadly leaving behind her 7-year-old daughter. I shut the TV off. I slumped all the way back in my chair and attempted to breathe. But every time I took a breath in, it wouldn't come out. I felt like I was suffocating. I tried to get up out of the chair, but I couldn't move. I was pinned. The world around me started to go blurry and dark. "Dr. Martin!" My secretary rushed into the room and quickly attempted to bring me back into full consciousness. Eventually, the world came into perspective again. I was able to comfortably lean forward and move around in the chair. I was able to exhale all of the air I was uncomfortably inhaling. "Are you all right?" she asked me, kneeling concernedly at my side. "Yes, I'll be all right," I managed to say in between my deep breaths in and out. "I can cancel the rest of your appointments today if you—" "No," I quickly answered. "I'll see all of my patients today." The secretary looked at me, unsure. "All right, as long as you feel up to it." "But," I began. I paused for a while as I contemplated making this decision. "I don't think I should be a therapist anymore." My secretary stood up, outraged at this. "What? You can't quit. There are so many people who need you." "Like Phoebe Callaghan?" I reminded. She sadly sighed, deeply defeated. "I don't think you should leave, but if you truly believe you have to, then I won't stop you. But I want you to think about it long and hard." I nodded slowly. "Oh," she reached into her back pocket and handed me an envelope. "The police came by this morning and dropped this off. They said Phoebe's daughter wanted you to have it." I inhaled deeply before taking the envelope from her. I thanked her before dismissing her back to her desk. Once she was out of the room, I stared at the envelope. I was absolutely dreading seeing its contents. I held it up to the light and saw the silhouette of a small black rectangle which took up about a quarter of the envelope. I knew it was a printed Polaroid picture of something. Before I could let myself say no, I tore open the envelope and slowly withdrew the picture from inside. The picture was blurry at best, and the camera seemed to be falling over as it snapped the scene, but the main focus of the photo was still very visible. Once I saw it, I completely froze up, letting the photo slowly drop onto the floor. As much as I've tried to forget all about this picture, it will never leave my memory. The image is forever burned into my brain. The right side of the photo seemed to be capturing a normal kitchen with a table and a stove in the background. But the left half of the photo showed a figure, dressed in all black, reaching directly for the camera with its long and hideous hands. The photo only allowed the viewer to see the torso and above. The hair on the top of its head was almost completely gone, but its scalp was old and had several cracks in it. On the side of its head, there were 2 large ears, almost twice the size of normal ears, and they stuck out of its skull like sore thumbs. But the most terrifying part of this beast was the face. Its awful face consisted of 2 empty, black eye sockets that still managed to stare directly at you. Just below the eye sockets was the creature's nose, and it was all crooked and terribly bent out of shape, like it had been smashed with a mallet. Then there was the mouth, if you even want to call it that. It was inhumanly wide open. No, it was completely unhinged from its jawline, which exposed several grotesque layers of teeth that pointed in every which way. If the creature closed its mouth, it would possibly puncture itself in several spots. When you stared directly at the creature, it seemed as though it was leaping directly out of the picture and right for you. It was merely waiting for you to whisper its name, and then it would wreak unspeakable havoc and pain onto you. This is why you must be careful when discussing this creature. You must be wary when it is around you. You must never whisper his name. Never whisper, Mr. Whisper.